Craig, you're up, and I'm very happy to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Craig Cipolla of the Royal Ontario Museum and the University of Toronto. I should mention that Dr. Cipolla deserves credit for proposing the theme of this year's symposium, and he's published influential books, textbooks, and articles on posthumanism, semiotics, ontology, assemblage theory, and critical appraisals of the new materialism. Dr. Cipolla's research focuses on North American archaeology, particularly New England and the Great Lakes. His main interests include archaeological theory, material culture, the archaeology of colonialism, Indigenous collaborative archaeology, and fieldwork. He currently directs the Mohegan Archaeological Field School in partnership with the Mohegan Tribe of Connecticut. And his paper this afternoon is entitled In Search of Different Pasts. Thanks very much, Craig. And do unmute yourself, Craig.
I was actually planning on giving the paper on mute the whole time. Can everyone see?
Yes, yeah. Looks good.
Thank you. Okay. So yeah, I acknowledge that I currently occupy the lands of the Mississauga, the Credit River, along with the Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee nations. I also acknowledge the teachings I take from doing collaborative Indigenous archaeology on the lands of the Mohegan and the Pequot of Connecticut in the current day United States. Oh. Okay. Recent discussions of ontological difference challenge archaeologists to ask new types of questions and to become more attuned to the limitations and arbitrariness of their particular understandings of the world. Ontologically concerned archaeologists attempt to self-police and regulate the role of Western defaults in their work, while opening up to Indigenous knowledge and expertise. In this paper, I explore how these recent discussions of difference translate into a general North American archaeological context. And when I say that, I mean how my experience doing archaeology. The settler colonial context of North American archaeology, especially Indigenous-led and collaborative research projects, serves important testing grounds for these new approaches and these new arguments. I highlight the importance of politics and colonial power differentials in the contours of such work and ask questions about how archaeologists think through difference and about the political and ethical implications of these efforts. Questions remain as to if and how archaeologists can avoid the essentialization of difference and the translation of alterity into subalterity. In order to further explore these questions, I compare recent ontologically concerned archaeologies with my experience as an outsider participant in collaborative Indigenous archaeology research projects and to my readings of Indigenous scholarship. The goal of this paper is to assess the relevance of ontologically concerned archaeologies for North American context, but also to place them into a critical light that will hopefully better define the role that Western sensibilities and power play in these new ontological programs. Ontologically focused archaeologies are correct in noting that important questions remain as to how we engage with difference. For example, when we learn that spiritual practices can heal diseases, or to take an example from my own research with the Mohegan, when we observe intentionally buried crystals placed in the ground to protect the land and its people. Oh. The disciplines of anthropology and archaeology boast deep histories of explaining away these differences in light of the observer's understanding of the world, explanations based on uncritical uses of analogy, or worse yet, human universals, lead to us to translate difference into the order of our world. This is not to assume the existence of some means of completely avoiding acts of translation. It is instead a call for increased attention on the labor that translation contributes to the emergence of the past. For someone like Edward Said, increased attention on how outsider observers understand and represent difference was absolutely crucial. This meant identifying how Western observers actively shaped, rather than passively observed, the subaltern other. Here, the sub in subaltern plays an important role, most culpable in the transformation of observed difference into something less than and opposed to the Western observer's culture or world, are cultural evolutionary models. Undergirding many Western Enlightenment inherited worldviews, evolutionary frameworks assert that all human collectives progress along a unilineal trajectory. Quote, "In the beginning, all the world was America," wrote John Locke in his second treatise of government. Therein, Locke justified colonization of indigenous lands through his description of the European ascent from nature to culture, and by with also describing indigenous peoples' so-called failure to do so. Terra nullius was the mantra evoked at this time. Westerners like Locke classified the Americas as empty land because they found no evidence of European-style modification and improvement. In such arguments, the non-Western past, or excuse me, the non-Western present transforms into the West's evolutionary past. In one fell swoop, Western observers familiarized, appropriated, and demoted the foreign, designated it as a stepping stone toward Western civilization, but also denying its difference or its novelty. For instance, Said wrote of how the other vacillated between, quote, the West's contempt for what is familiar and its shivers of delight in or fear of novelty. As his work attests, fear and rejection of difference often lead down well-worn colonial paths. How can archaeology avoid the forms of fear and contempt that Said warned against? Enter the ontological terms. Philosophers use the term ontology to refer to what is. That is the mind-independent nature of the world, as opposed to how humans know the world, that is epistemology. Directly related to this realist philosophical orientation are archaeological iterations of ontology that draw attention to how our materials, defined very broadly, reveal themselves to us in our work. Yet, rather than finding a single ontological turn in contemporary archaeological theory, in what follows, I ambitiously discuss 5 ontological turns. And it seems that every time I sit down to write about the ontological turns, I add a new one. So the next time you ask me about it, there'll be 6. But these 5 that I'm bringing out represent different lines of reasoning, respectively focused on, worldviews, relations, objects, worlds, and singular instances of radical difference. Each comes with a unique but related set of orientations and goals, worthy of critical attention. The rigidity of these types, by the way, should not be overestimated. And by the way, I haven't changed anything since we started this discussion, so a lot of this is subject for discussion, but there you go. In practice, archaeological theorists mix and match these categories, sometimes with very little attention to the differences that I highlight here. I use these 5 lines of thought only as a heuristic device to discuss similarities, differences, and points in need of further clarification. Of particular interest for this discussion is how each of these types relates to what we might call a meta-ontology, which has already been discussed since last night. And I think of this as a broad framework in which one compares, contrasts, and combines different ways of being in the world, and then takes that and possibly applies it to other situations in the world as we move through it. Here's my first ontological turn. Worldview-centered approaches are the most familiar for archaeologists. Their origins usually trace back to Hallowell's classic essay, Ojibwe Ontology, Behavior, and Worldview, and they resemble long-standing relativist discussions of culture. Practitioners using this approach attempt to reconstruct non-Western worldviews. Maria Nieves Cedeno's work on Blackfoot and general Native American worldviews stands as an excellent example. Her writings on index objects and animacy focus on how, for Blackfoot people, certain types of objects have special capacities and powers to transform other objects, people, and places that surround them. Cedeno derived this information from contemporary Blackfoot people and applied it critically to archaeological typologies that that could potentially overlook the importance of this distinction. Cedeno thus critiques and adjusts archaeological epistemologies in relation to indigenous worldviews. These adjustments are perhaps the main way in which worldview-centered inquiries distinguish themselves from standard archaeological and anthropological studies of culture, say. The use of this term ontology here departs slightly from the term's traditional uses in philosophy, In these cases, ontology is not simply what is, but rather what is according to a particular normative cultural perspective. And from there, the analyst might create a hybridized epistemology derived from at least two worldviews, that of the archaeologist and that of the indigenous collaborator or interlocutor. These approaches carefully consider indigenous knowledge, and in doing so, allow researchers the opportunity to use this to shape their disciplinary lens. They do so in order to generate new questions and angles of articulation with archaeological materials. But at the same time, they also run the risk of maintaining certain dualisms associated with representationalism, taking attention away from the materials themselves. And in other words, these approaches focus on what things represented and did from one specific cultural perspective, rather than, as discussed in other papers today, how things relate and behave beyond specific cultural advantages. The second set of approaches focus on relationality. Here, relationality serves as a new meta-ontology meant to improve our understanding of the world and to shake off Enlightenment sensibilities. These approaches gravitate toward various forms of metaphysical realism. According to this approach, agency emerges from relationships. This is a speculative proposition for how the world works, regardless of any specific cultural understandings of it. These approaches emerged in opposition to Enlightenment-inspired humanism that characterizes Western worldviews. Archaeologists in North America like Tim Pocketot argue that we must rethink the human, and in so doing attempt to identify and mitigate the covert push and pull of Western dualisms in our interpretations. With these approaches, researchers give non-human things their due, recognizing human dependence on and entanglement with the non-human world. Compared to worldview-centered frameworks, these approaches fall much closer to philosophical discussions of ontology by speculating on the mind-independent status of the world, and from there, considering human histories and perspectives on it. Altogether, these approaches work toward recognizing the important roles that materials and things play in human history, opening up new questions on the vibrancy of matter and on human contingency. Compared with worldview-centered approaches, one could argue that these new foci on relations take all human knowledge, including indigenous knowledge, less seriously than they do their own propositions about how the world works. Practitioners using this approach must still explain how local perspectives and concepts fit within this realist framework, and this is something that we've been talking about again and again today. As noted elsewhere, relational approaches run the risk of homogenizing different histories in favor of a universal relationality. Object-centered approaches emerge from the relational terms just described. And that's why they have a lot of similarities. As you can see, I replicated the text. They pose questions on how objects exist beyond their relations. The key thinker behind these new ideas is philosopher Graham Harman, who builds upon and critiques Latour's actor network theory while rejecting new materialisms or assemblage theory altogether. He acknowledges the importance of Latour's non-anthropocentric or post-anthropocentric framework, but finds fault in his myopic focus on relations. According to Harman, the network draws attention away from the objects themselves. For him, all objects defined broadly hold something in reserve. As with the relation-centered approaches set out earlier, object-centered approaches embrace realism and frame all human knowledge of the world as partial and skewed. These approaches do, however, frame their object-oriented view of the world as more accurate than other approaches. Importantly, for the present discussion, object-oriented approaches maintain a hard distinction between epistemology, what we know, and ontology, what there is. As discussed later in this paper, this view contrasts sharply with certain indigenous ontologies that closely integrate knowing and being. The fourth set of approaches reviewed here is the most radical, perhaps. It draws inspiration from the perspectivism of Bertha Castro and aspires to move away from the meta-ontological frameworks that undergird worldview-centered, relation-centered, and object-centered approaches. This means attempting to do more than simply establish equal footing between Western and indigenous ontologies. It entails accepting indigenous ontological propositions and attempting to move beyond Western ontological propositions that stand in contradiction. The pioneers of this approach in archaeology, Ben Alberti, who we heard from yesterday, and Yvonne Marshall, sought to explore the possibility for worlds very different from their own. Rather than see the world as characterized by a universal reality, relational or otherwise, Alberti and Marshall sought to elevate the importance of local knowledges and sensibilities. And by the way, I'm referring to 2009. And so Ben has definitely changed the way he's thinking about these things. And perhaps he's more like the fifth way that I'm going to go to in a second. These thinkers argue that their approach allows them to take Indigenous knowledge seriously, transforming it into archaeological theory. In making such claims, however, it becomes imperative to demonstrate that these approaches are more than archaeological business as usual, where Western meta-ontology frames the interpretations and narratives that result from this type of exploratory work. A major challenge for these forms of ontologically informed archaeology lies in the materials. The archaeologists attempting this work, at least 10 years ago when it was introduced, seek to better understand Indigenous worlds through their own engagement with artifacts. And so the question remains, where is this source of knowledge? Where is this source of alterity? Is it in Western archaeologists simply looking at artifacts in a new way? Is it through collaboration and discussion? Or is it directly from Indigenous peoples? As I recently argued, the results closely resemble those of general relational approaches. And I'm not saying that we need to disregard it because of this. I'm just saying we need to look at this a little bit more carefully and think about how they relate. Going back to the first question I posed to Ben when I first met him and when I talked with him last night. So and we need to look, these resemble these relational approaches in which everything is unstable and in a constant state of becoming, at least in my reading of some of that early work. In other words, despite their insistence on the importance of the local, world-centered approaches describe strikingly similar worlds regardless of the time period and place theorized. At least that's my interpretation, and it's probably wrong. An obvious means of exploring these propositions further lies with Indigenous archaeologists and with collaborative Indigenous archaeology projects that actually involve Indigenous people and Indigenous knowledge and do not depend upon Western translations of Indigenous perspectives into archaeological theory. I could have stopped there, but I've decided to introduce a fifth because I think a lot of this perspectivist-inspired thinking has led down a sort of different avenue than it was framed originally about 10 years ago. So the fifth and last set of approaches also build upon the work of Iberis de Castro and are thought of in similar ways as the world-centered approaches just mentioned. Instead of aiming holistically to explore worlds otherwise, and perhaps that's a wrong interpretation of that initial literature, these approaches, perhaps best exemplified by someone like Darrell Wilkinson, focus only on instances of radical difference. So, for instance, the moment when quartz crystal protects people and places. And it looks at how these instances challenge our defaults. In my reading, these approaches maintain a meta-ontology, and I'm willing to be wrong, that integrates our experience with difference, bringing them very close to the first approach, those world-centered approaches. I also see this as closely related to how collaborative Indigenous archaeology actually works. At least in my experience. But similar to worldview-centered, the fourth approach we talked about, these instance-centered approaches are difficult to fathom in the absence of Indigenous people with which to work and converse. Otherwise, radical difference becomes a projection of the analyst and interpreter. The 5 types of ontologically concerned archaeology caricatured here demonstrate variable framing of Indigenous and Western knowledge. Some seem to result in a dualistic and asymmetrical treatment of the two. Worldview-centered approaches maintain a binary between these forms of knowledge, ultimately keeping an explicit Western meta-ontology, but also striving for hybridized models that are ultimately animated by archaeological perspectives, I guess. Relation-centered approaches and object-centered approaches move away from the dualism between Western and Indigenous knowledge, framing all as general human knowledge. They explicitly maintain a Western meta-ontology, albeit improved with new relational and thing-centered theories. Overall, however, relational and thing-centered ontologies still struggle with recognizing the local in relation to the universal. Fourth, world-centered approaches, fourth, world-centered approaches, this is a complex diagram, maintain a binary between the West and the rest and attempt to circumnavigate the former in search of the latter, in my reading. Implicitly, they appear to maintain a Western meta-ontology framed as a less than Western approach, at least compared to the first 3 lines of thought. The fifth focuses on singular instances of radical difference. I didn't diagram this one, sorry. Its goals are not as holistic as the other approaches. It maintains a sharp focus on letting instances of radical difference challenge Western defaults and allowing people like me to suspend our disbelief, if you will. This combination sets it slightly apart from all the others. Now, sorry. Having now reviewed and sorted the key theories used to explore difference in archaeology from my reading, something is clearly amiss. It seems odd for a paper devoted to alterity to mainly cite Euro-descended scholars like myself. A few years ago, as we have already heard, Métis scholar Zoe Todd brought this crucial issue to the fore. And this is me doing a very job at PowerPointing. I shouldn't have put that abstract up there because you're going to read the abstract instead of listen to what I have to say, but that's okay. Her words are better than mine anyway. She made important points about vastly asymmetrical citational practices in anthropology. But Todd's article has much deeper implications. She pointed out the similarities between some of the ontological approaches outlined earlier, specifically the relational approaches that I talked about, and indigenous perspectives. From there, she emphasized ongoing colonial power asymmetries and practices hidden beneath these new arguments. Todd warned that ontologically engaged scholars run the risk of cherry-picking aspects of indigenous knowledge for purely academic pursuits without recognizing the broader context. Practitioners must ask about how they gained access to this knowledge. More importantly, they must recognize that indigenous ontologies and epistemologies represent, quote, legal orders through which indigenous peoples throughout the world are fighting for self-determination, sovereignty, end quote. Ontological cherry picking tends to overlook certain connections between researcher and world. What about the similarities, continuities, and inequalities that exist between observer, cherry picker, and observed? There's also a problem of selectivity. For instance, in a North American context, an outside researcher interested in ontological difference might show great interest in notions of animism. This helps them publish papers, but might disregard indigenous taboos about disturbing the dead or disturbing ceremonial sites and objects with archaeology. This stops them from collecting certain types of data. When it comes to issues of sovereignty in particular, it is important to remember that difference from the West served as a powerful colonial tool over the last 500 years. For example, we could look at the earlier quotation from John Locke and the idea of terra nullius that comes out of that. My point, similar to that of Todd, is that the ontological turns sometimes run risks of overlooking a host of relations like similarities, continuities, and inequalities. And this is not an argument that we should make everyone the same. It's just that we need to recognize both of those types of relations. They might overlook these similarities, continuities, and inequalities in their academic quest to come to grips with ontological difference. They are similarly vulnerable to glossing over the practical outcomes of their ontological claims and their implications for the future. Perhaps there might be an essentialization of difference or some othering there that even isn't intended, of course, but it comes out with how people respond to that work. Increased critical attention to the asymmetry of our bibliographies is an important starting point, and we were just talking about this, but it is only a means to an end. There's a fine line, as emphasized by Todd, between properly acknowledging indigenous expertise and thought in our work and misrepresenting and or using it in an exploitative manner. I read Todd's critique as a call to trace how sources compare, including sources of indigenous knowledge and sources of Western archaeology, and to invest time in trying to understand just how different sources differ from one another. For instance, we could look at the first example in Zoe Todd's paper, looking at some ideas from Latour and the concept of sila. There are many similarities. There's also a lot of differences, I think. This is something I recently attempted with my colleagues concerning theory in and of the Mohegan Archaeological Project, and this is something that Ben was kind enough to talk about last night. As a Euro-descended settler colonist in North America, one who practices North American archaeology no less, the only way to approach these problems is by explicitly acknowledging the colonial relations of which they are part. This means attempting to push Western knowledge off center stage, and this is something that Keisha was just talking about, while adding new sources of knowledge. But it also means recognizing that I, as a scholar, as a person, as whatever, do not have all the answers and cannot understand ontological difference free from the weight of colonialism or from my Euro-descended settler colonial senses. Now, we've already talked about this. The work of Deloria Jr. stands as an important source of critique of Western mistreatment, misunderstanding, and misrepresentation of Indigenous peoples. Deloria's writings make vital contributions to ontological questions in archaeology and to general efforts to identify and challenge Eurocentrism inherent in our methods. In God is Red, for instance, he outlined important differences between Western and Indigenous relations to and understandings of reality. Deloria pointed to the tensions that arise from Western insistence upon the separation of epistemology, what we know, and ontology, what there is, versus Indigenous North American fusion of these categories where perception and knowledge intersect much more closely. For instance, in discussing the idea of seeing a ghost, Deloria argues that an Indigenous person might confront, quote, the reality of the experience, and while he or she may not make immediate sense of it, it is not rejected as an invalid experience. Yet, for Western thinkers, the teachings of a lifetime come thundering down. Reality, in a certain sense, is what you allow your mind to accept, not what you experience. To put this into the context of our discussion and into the context of contemporary archaeological theory, this example lays bare the differences between a flat ontology, where you accept the reality of experience without translating it with common sense and explaining it away, and the difference in that and a dualist ontology, dualist Western ontology, where common sense tells us what is possible at all times. In the metaphysics of modern existence, and as I put this slide up, I realized that this discussion of a ghost actually comes from this book. I'm sorry about that. But in the metaphysics of modern existence, Deloria draws on Indigenous and Western sources in search of a new hybrid vision of reality. The new vision that Deloria presented transcended divides between Indigenous, non-Indigenous, and science and religion, while continuing to expose the cracks in arbitrariness of Western defaults. For Deloria, of course, this new orientation to reality involved opening up to Indigenous knowledge. Deloria called for a synthetic view that recognized continuities and convergences without erasing the distinctions. The new vision that Deloria described in many ways resembles the relation-centered ontological approaches discussed earlier, and this supports Todd's argument that Western anthropologists often reinvent Indigenous-made whales. Similar to Deloria's broad goals in this book, archaeologists practicing collaborative Indigenous archaeology and community-based participatory archaeology focus on how these diverse forms of archaeology bring different knowledges together in a shared ontological space. Sonya Atalay describes this space in terms of knowledge braiding. For her, the concept shows, quote, the potential for knowledge to be valued, reworked, and combined in community-based archaeology, end quote. The Mohegan Archaeological Field School, a collaborative research and teaching project I'm involved with, takes a similar braiding approach. Although collaborative Indigenous archaeologists rarely discuss theory in print, and this is one of those privileges I was highlighting earlier, I suspect that more attention to theory and collaborative Indigenous archaeology would shed valuable light on some of the theoretical questions explored in the symposium. In this spirit, we at the Mohegan Archaeological Field School recently shifted our focus to how collaboration remakes archaeology, and we have a grant for that, where we're doing the ethnography of collaborative archaeological practice. We explore how this relates to recent ontological turns in a co-authored article as well, and this is another one that was generously discussed by Ben. Co-authorship allowed us to address the similarities and differences between authors' respective understandings of several different things, including how we know the past, how we define archaeological data in light of our critiques of false divides between nature and culture for various different reasons, how we understand humans and their relation to the world, and how we view aspects of our shared histories, including the history of settler colonialism in North America, which has thoroughly wrapped all of us up in that history. Important, but in different ways, of course. Important for the present argument, we took a one world, if you will, meta-ontological approach in this article that recognizes continuities and distinctions between participants and between authors. Such a project would fail, by the way, if I attempted to take on the views of my collaborators and co-authors, or regarding Todd Todd's critique if I attempted to downplay the actual sources of my knowledge. So Ben was right. We were citing people like Mike Manuel DeLanda in there, but we're also citing people like Gladys Tantaquidgeon, who was not the current Mohegan medicine woman, but the previous one, who was 106 years old and who died in the 1990s. Anyway, anyway. The inverse is also true for my collaborators and co-authors. The project would fail if they attempted to simply take on my perspectives of the world. In fact, collaborative indigenous archaeology only works when you have a shared world that respects similarities and differences. Here, respect denotes recognizing alterity, but attempting to avoid subalterity, which is a tricky one. This task connects directly to the work of Gerald Vizenor as well. Academics know Vizenor for his use and development of the term survivance, and I do believe that Lindsay will talk a little bit more about Vizenor in her paper. Survivance is an anti-essentialist and non-dualistic critique of how mainly Western writers understand and represent Indigenous history. The term refers to the continued dynamic and active presence of Indigenous peoples. This contrasts sharply with Western representations of indigeneity, and of course, some anthropological representations of indigeneity. Vizenor critiques misunderstandings and misrepresentations of indigeneity by thinking critically about similarities across and differences between the binary of colonist-colonized. He looked at how Indigenous people actively mix these two essentialized categories in colonial contexts. The question remains as to whether or not Western archaeologists can ever escape the colonial sensibilities that they inherit from their world. The sensibilities and tendencies, of course, critiqued by Vizenor. What I read in his work is a message that all academics and archaeologists can and should attempt to decolonize, both on their own and in collaboration, but they should use the word sparingly, of course, going back to Keisha's recommendation for decolonization is not a metaphor last night. This means opening up to dynamic Indigenous histories that push back against static essentialist tropes. But there lurks an ever-present risk that colonial sensibilities will creep back in as soon as we let our guard down and decide that we have finally liberated ourselves from the tyranny of this view, or that we finally know how to take Indigenous perspectives seriously. We can absolutely strive to decolonize, to be settler allies, to learn from Vizenor's writings, to learn from Lindsay, to learn from Keisha, to learn from Gladys Tantaquidgeon, but we will always be susceptible to creeping colonialisms. The ontological turns that I discussed could be important steps in reducing Eurocentrism in the discipline and thinking differently. For me, this means identifying and challenging the taken for granted ethnocentric defaults of archaeology. In some cases, this means opening up the discipline to a wider segment of society by asking difficult questions and approaching our work in new ways. This argument connects directly to the types of explicitly political paths charted by Rachel earlier and definitely charted next by Lindsay. This paper demonstrates that it is crucial to continue asking new questions about how we understand different pasts. And I think that this is something with which Saeed would agree. As I've noted, however, it is also important to guard against creeping colonialism, against the essentialization of difference and the sub and subalterity. One very practical way to do this is to work and write with different archaeologists. For me, this comes in the form of collaborative projects like the one at Mohegan and like the book on which most of the papers in this symposium derive. Following Todd, we must read more than Western philosophers when attempting to achieve this goal, and we must recognize the broader context from which Indigenous knowledge originates. There are potentially powerful synergies between these more practical goals and the theoretical frameworks of the ontological turns described in this paper. Yet in my view, arguments against meta-ontologies simply do not work in these settings, at least for people like me, because I always have a meta-ontology. On the other hand, quests for orientations to our work that forego a meta-ontology initiate serious considerations of difference. On the other hand, I think they leave the gate open to colonialism and appropriation. They do so by taking attention away from our own sensibilities and situatedness and how they guide us to sample and frame the archaeological problems and patterns we hope to solve. In this way, my argument connects back to feminist arguments for situated knowledge. I sense that the ontological turns in North America live their best lives in dialogue with Indigenous peoples. For me, this comes in the form of collaborative Indigenous archaeology that braids knowledge, or whatever metaphor you want, and recognizes collaboration as an assemblage that is greater than the sum of its parts. I think actually Ben quoted me on that one last night. We must always remember that we are the parts of the world that we aim to understand, including the past that we write and the differences that we find. Thank you so much for listening, and thanks particularly to Ben, who, obviously this paper was in reaction to some of his work, but in reality, we all know I'm a bottom feeder academic, you know what I mean? So hopefully I'll be able to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Craig. Questions from our panel? You rendered them speechless, Craig.
This is the first time ever.
I mean, I have things to say, but I don't want to hog the. I don't want to get too into the weeds with Craig here.
Yeah.
So I'm going to wait.
Okay.
Well,
man, I really.
There's a question from Alexa in the Q&A if you want to start there.
The first time it's ever
They're
happened.
still taking notes, the panel, you know.
Silenced everyone. Good God. Oh my God, I'm gonna have to reflect on this a lot tonight. Okay, in light of Craig's paper on 5 ontological turns, I would like to hear more about the panel's opinions about archaeological reflexivity. In the practice of archaeology, fieldwork is guided by what is known and of interest in designing collaborative research projects. I'm curious about the impact of blind spots in retrospect. Furthermore, Keisha's paper yesterday brilliantly demonstrated the importance of sitting with material remains of past peoples and the interpretive significance of imagining the process of making a beaded artifact. Is archaeological practice failing in not returning to these material remains, relegating them as deposits and museum storage? So I'm going to leave that to the panel, probably Keisha. Or maybe not.
Well, I mean, I think that this is a really important place for us to sit, because coming back to what we really engage with, which is the materiality of the past and the materiality of the past in the present, right? So a lot of the our attempts to make sense of the past are always grounded in our contemporary present. And this comes back, I think, to Craig, what you're talking, there's some elements of what you're talking about is we're trying to make sense of these ontologies, but we're not in them. Or in many cases, even when you're Rachel working in Bronze Age Isle of Man, like you're in the Isle of Man, but you're not in Bronze Age Isle of Man. And so there's always the actual materiality of the past is what allows us to even engage with those pasts. And I think that when we treat the materials in particular sorts of ways, it influences what we're able to understand about them. And so for me, this idea that this beadwork is actually a teacher, it is actually a relative, teaches me a lot about how I think about the past, but also how I think about what those materials do in the present. And also coming back to Rachel's point about future, right? So for me, to put all of the belongings of our ancestors in museums is actually to undermine Indigenous futures in a lot of ways. Like it doesn't allow the materiality to be in the present. It assumes that it's a past thing, right? So it's the materials from the past that go here. But in my worldview, the past and the present aren't separated in that way. And the power of those belongings actually really has a lot of potential for our futures. So I think being with the materials of the past is actually an important part of what it means to be archaeologists, certainly, but it also is really important to think about who decides what is done with them, right?
Thank you, Keisha. Yes, Ali.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that. I think, to give an example, Rachel and I direct a project which is looking at use-wear and microwear analysis of objects from 3000 Cal BC, so the middle of the Neolithic through to the Iron Age. And one of the ways we're trying to conceptualize the marks that are produced on those materials is not simply in terms of function or the traditional ways in which microwear and use-wear works, but actually as a form of what we call material memory, which is actually trying to engage with the objects to elicit those memories from the objects through the kind of methodologies that are associated with microwear and use-wear, which Rachel's much more qualified than me to talk about. But I think for us, that's a case of thinking about how memories can operate in much more than human ways, the ways in which they can become contracted into material things, the way in which those memories become, can become apparently absent, but then can be made present through a whole host of humans and non-humans working together, including microscopes and people and reference collections and those sorts of things. And it's really interesting thinking about the place of the museum in this, because a lot of our objects come from museums and they basically live in drawers. Particularly, we borrow from one particular very large museum where all of these objects are completely absent from any form of engagement almost all of the time. So these aren't on display, they're not being seen by anybody, and these are objects from the British past. And so in a sense, these are the only forms of interaction people really have with these objects, is through these kind of research projects, which is an opportunity for those memories to re-emerge in a way that I don't think they would be able to otherwise, through that kind of a dialogue that we have with materials in that context.
To add on a tiny little bit there, in terms of that project, one of the things that we're trying to do with it is to think about how we can bring stone and metal into the same framework of thinking and analysis. And that's about that kind of disruptive relational practice that Keisha was talking about in relation to her database and all of those kinds of things. And one of the things that I've been trying to do in my work is kind of, I look at the very earliest metals and to stop thinking about them as really separate from stone tools and to start thinking about them in the same framework. And so one of the things that I've argued in some of my recent work is that the very earliest metal work isn't really metally at all. It's more like a form of stone. And you can see that from the way that people are working it, people are using it, and the kind of the interaction with it. And it's one of those things where thinking relationally and putting, literally in the case of this project, putting the metal objects from the grave in the same space in our lab as the stone objects from the grave, rather than in the museums these things come from. Metal lives in one store on one side of London, lithics lives in the other store on the other side of London, and those two materials never speak to each other at all. And thinking about them instead in that same framework has been a really kind of an interesting thing for the project to do. And I think it's producing some interesting thinking already that talks about that, thinking of those things as relational and disrupting those categories.
Thank you for that, Rachel. Okay, great, Ben.
Thinking along taking that question from Alexa, but taking it slightly differently and responding a little bit to a question that Craig had in his talk. So approaching materials, which, believe it or not, I also do. In my spare time, I have, but the materials that I've looked at in Argentina have been museum collections of materials. But in terms of thinking about marks that are left on objects, which I don't think of in terms of memory, but maybe it could be couched in that way. But when I'm talking of my approach to ontological in archaeology, Craig, which I'm a little resentful that you put Daryl as number 5 and me as number 4. I'm joking, but I think actually the 5th one is more, maybe my work has changed. The 5th one is more what I'm trying to do, which is not to reconstruct past ontologies, which is very clearly an impossibility, and it has all sorts of problematic things about it when you phrase it in that way. But it's rather to kind of prime yourself to look at archaeological materials in a way that ontological difference, which will have existed in the past, quite probably, possibly, has a way to come out through the materials. So in terms of analysis, so it's a methodological point. So alterity is not, when I'm talking about alterity, I'm not talking about kind of reconstructing somebody else's alterity, whatever that is, somebody else's ontology. That's not alterity to me. Alterity to me is radical difference. Which you can kind of prepare yourself to accept the influence of, I suppose, through readings and so forth, or relationships with people who have other ontological commitments to your own. But when you approach your material, then get back to Alexa's question, to me, it's about trying to figure out ways in which the original difference got into the material through the practices of making and other things such as that. So this is a very kind of contemporary project in the sense of I'm thinking with Tim Ingold, and I'm thinking with other people to try and understand the process of making and how it is, how do we fuse ideas and things in the process of making so that you have things like your experiences of what your ontological commitments get into the stuff that you're making, not in a kind of hylomorphic way, not in the imposing of meaning, but through the acts of making itself. So yes, that would be my response to that question.
And I would just say, Ben, you know, I think as I wrote the paper, I realized that I think that world-centered thing is really inspired by some of my reading of very early how you're thinking about it. And I think I kind of indicated, maybe I didn't, but I think that you're kind of more, you're in the latter phase, you know. There's a question here that I'm happy to answer for all of us, I guess, from Fan. The layperson's question is from Craig and all panelists. When philosophy enters archaeology, it becomes archaeological, as seen in panelists' conception of localization and Craig's tour de force play on the idea of ontology. My question is, while archaeologists humbly refer to philosophers in their comfortable armchair rarely, if ever, refer back to archaeologists. Do you think it's just their loss, or it's archaeology's loss as well? I don't know. I mean, fans asked me a version of this question in multiple different venues. I will tell you, we actually had a philosopher read our book for us, and I don't know if she'll ever cite it, but she said she kind of liked it. She might have been not telling the truth, I guess. I think it's an interesting question. I think I'm really interested in the part where and how things transform as we start using them. Going back to some of the argument about Deleuze and like, well, Braidotti's Braidotti now. You know, you don't have to worry about Deleuze through Braidotti. I think it's a similar thing to Barris de Castro. Like, what is, he works in a very different way than we work, right? So when we bring him into the archaeological museum or whatever, it becomes a different set of things. And I'm really interested in that idea. I don't have any great answers to your question, Fan, but I'm sure my colleagues here do.
Yes, Ollie.
I was going to say, someone in the chat, it might be anonymous, I can't see, has pointed out that Deleuze and Guattari actually draw a great deal from archaeology. And they do that certainly. I mean, Leroux-Guérin appears quite extensively in their references, for example. And they're drawing on both anthropology and archaeology quite a lot. But Graham Harman, I mean, much as I was disagreeing with him earlier, cites Ian Hodder all the time and draws on Hodder's work all the time in talking about object-oriented stuff and how much he's learned from Hodder. So in that sense, I think there is a kind of engagement with some archaeological thinking. The other object-oriented ontologist, Levi Bryan, is, if you read his blog, he waxes lyrical about Bjorn Olsen and Chris Whitmore. Chris Whitmore is described, I mean, I quote almost verbatim, as a titan of a man, as much philosopher as archaeologist, which is, you know, Chris is pretty tall, so fair play on that front. So I'd push back a little bit on the absence of engagement there. And of course, there's also the tradition of using archaeology as a metaphor, which Foucault is, you know, a classic example of. Freud is another example of kind of the metaphor of archaeology, which isn't the same thing at all. But there is that little bit of use. As to whether philosophers are missing out, I don't really know, probably. I'd like to think so, but I'm not really quite sure on what. I don't really know what the answer to that part is, but I think some philosophers have been drawing on archaeology.
And there's also, you know, someone like Alison Wiley, who is a philosopher of archaeology. So archaeology is the place in which her philosophy derives, a philosopher of science, right? And this is the kind of core of what she does. And there's not perhaps a ton of people like that, but I agree there's a lot more kind of interlinkages than might immediately emerge. But again, you know, if you had this conversation among philosophers, it would be a different conversation, I think, because, you know, anyway, so I think that's an interesting question. But again, I think sometimes those linkages are maybe not as obvious as we might see. I did have something, Craig, to kind of, I want to talk a little bit about change and time, and specifically in terms of how we think about Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous ontology, because I think there's a danger, and certainly within the context of the histories of North America, is to fall too much back on even an essentialized version of knowledge and how it's generated. Because of course, you know, all Indigenous communities in these lands have been have suffered genocide, right? And have had really long-lasting effects that have in some ways transformed the way they are in the world and the knowledges that are held because of the colonial sort of history. So how do you think through, changing Indigenous knowledges through time so that we're not caught back in the sort of authentic or traditional models, but recognizing that these are dynamic systems? So how do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I got a question once, and maybe this is not related. I got a question once. I remember every question I ever get when I give a lecture, especially the ones where they really try to dig in. So I got one question once where they said, well, some people say that colonialism was a glacier, and it just like went through and just erased everything here in North America. And my answer was, yeah, but there's still something there, right? There's still something there to study, right? There's a pattern, there's a material pattern that you can study. And so I guess, I think, again, because I work mainly in the 18th century right now, the 19th century, just like you do, actually. So this is a vital question where we have to be careful when we engage with our archaeological material. I mean, this goes way back, right? This goes back to the acculturation narratives from the 1950s. That, when we go back and we look at, what that, how you look at how authentic someone is based on if they have stone tools or not, or something like that. I think the key thing when we do archaeology is remembering who lived at that place, right? So I know, there's certain things that I'm not open to negotiating. Like, I know Mohegan people lived here, right? And so this is a Mohegan household space, if we're right that it's a house. And so my job is to sort of explore what that Mohegan space looked like with my colleagues. But I don't think we're ever open to saying, this isn't Mohegan anymore. So we're always asking the question within being Mohegan and becoming Mohegan as time unfolded. We're starting to write a book right now about the idea of a sort of the period of allotment, where you go from a communally held land to actually Mohegan people petitioning the Connecticut government saying, we want individually owned land. And we're looking at the archaeology of that. Well, you can look at that as a very Euro-American process. And Rachel actually writes about my own work in her book, A Brother Town of Ethnogenesis, where they became United States citizens in the 19th century, right? And so many people look at that as the erasure of indigeneity. But I suppose the thing that I hold constant in that work is that this is an indigenous space, or this is an indigenous, as long as I'm sure that that's true, right? There's many places where you can't be sure of that, but I have the privilege, again, of working in places over the last 30 years where I'm in a reservation that was founded, early on. So there might be different types of people there, but it's a Mohegan land. It's Mohegan land. It's Mohegan space, and we're not asking questions where we're going to try to identify ethnicity or something from the things we dig up. We're talking about other things going on. Plurality is something we study a lot.
Yeah, I think that's really important, because I think, there's the danger in sort of saying, X amount of change means you're no longer that thing, that identity, like that somehow. But the fact is, identities are constantly in the processes of becoming. And so I hear my colleagues being like, well, I can't really say that 1,000 years ago that this was, these people. I'm like, well, but this is their land. Of course it was. It wasn't the same version of it as it is now. But, what it meant to be Cree 200 years ago is not what it means to be Cree today, but it doesn't mean they're less Cree, right? They're still, and so this is where that interplay between like knowledge and information, but also then back to this question of ontology, because they're still living in the world in a Cree way, right? They're still being in the world in that way too. So, yeah.
Well, one thing, I write about this double-edged sword where you get like this narrative at first where you have to find radical difference, or you have to find difference with the sort of idea of terra nullius colonialism, right? Indigenous people live in a very different way from Europeans, so we can take the land. But then shortly after that, it transforms to the flip, right? You look too much like me. You're too similar to me, so I can take your land. And this is things like this narrative has been owned by, I don't believe I'm going to do this, but by unfortunately the president of the United States. He gives that. I don't know how he got that job, by the way. What the hell's that? But he uses that narrative as well. That flip narrative.
Well, thanks to the panelists very, very much. Thank you, Craig, for an interesting talk. There is a comment by Steve Dorland that you can all take a look at about museums. And I have a quick question, Craig, if that's okay. Just I know I shouldn't abuse my power here, but I was intrigued by your taxonomy, your 5 ontologies, and I can very much understand, and I agree with you that the issue with the worlds and worldviews is that it does seem to default between a West versus the rest. And my one thing being uncomfortable with relational ontologies, it does seem to be applied to many different cultures. And one person that hasn't been discussed too much, to my surprise, in these papers is Descolas. His own taxonomies, right, of animism and analogism, totemism, naturalism. And I think we would probably pigeonhole him in both the worlds and worldviews, depending on where he's writing and what he's doing. But it makes me think of what Keisha was saying about, are we living in ontologies? And this just reminds me, maybe reminds us all to be critical sometimes again of the terms that we use, because I never feel like I live in an Ingoldian meshwork, right? That's maybe a meta-ontology of this realism of what the world's about. And I even think assemblage theory works great. I like the idea of envisioning the world as made up of assemblages of different intensities and different extensions, and what are the assembling forces that territorialize, deterritorialize. But once again, my lived reality, I don't see it, I don't feel it. To think a little bit of the phenomenology that Sophie was talking about. In my embodied reality, I don't quite see it that way. And so there can sometimes be, I think, contradictions as well. I don't know, maybe we should even leave ontology to the physicists and talk about, on a certain level. I mean, depending on what we're thinking about and what we're saying. And I'm intrigued by your 5th category. And I know Ben had some questions about it. I'd maybe like to hear a little bit more about, can you give us an example, either archaeologically or live quotidian reality of this a 5th ontological moment?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think there's plenty of examples. I mean, the classic example in the literature is you turn into a jaguar or not. Someone tells me they turn into a jaguar, or the power thing from Martin Holbrad, where this is a moment where he argues that you take that for what it is and you don't try to translate it. Oh, it stands for power. So what I'm always wondering about, Ed, I think I actually probably share a lot of your views, or similar parallel views with what you're saying, is what do we do after that moment? And by just selecting that moment, there is a meta ontology that we're trying to fit it into. Is there not? We're saying, like, when I see something that really jumps out to me, I need to make sure I don't mistranslate that. I think this all goes back to this discussion that started yesterday. It's the relationship between local and universalizing knowledges, or grounded knowledge and metaphysics. I don't have great answers for you, Ed. I feel like there's plenty of contradictions in everything we do. I don't think anyone's free from contradictions.
Well, that's why it's tough, right? Because I see assemblage theory as the theory, not an ontology. I see it very much as a theory. And Vine Delorian's, whose work I very much admire and has influenced me as well, and tries to say that there isn't a distinction as much, perhaps, between ontology and epistemology. But of course, even among indigenous groups, there are people with very different viewpoints, with contradictory viewpoints. You think of the word viewpoint, and so to reduce it or distill it to an ontological calculus, I think at times could possibly be dangerous. I mean, on a certain level, But,
I agree with that. I think
it's to say the West is the only people that have some purview to epistemology, I think, is just as reprehensible as, I mean, but this is what makes it tricky, right?
Yeah, I don't disagree with any of that. I think that's what I was kind of arguing in a way.
Yeah, no, I agree. Ben.
So I just wanted to make a comment on something, the distinction between, this notion of over kind of rigid ontologies, or even the idea of ontology as a category, versus this, as Ed said, I don't feel like I'm living in a flux or in this or the other way of thinking. So the way what occurs to me is that the sense that we live in this notion of lived world, it's still a metaphysical concept, I think. I think it's kind of a default thing that we slip to, which has its roots in phenomenological thinking and other types of thinking. So, and the ontological rigid category type thing that people critique has its roots in structuralist thinking. So of course they look very different, but it's funny. I think it's a mistake to say that one's very rigid when it has, but really life is this way. When the two of them are still, they're equally metaphysical kind of theories about how life is lived. One of them doesn't escape just because it's lived experience. That doesn't escape a framework of a metaphysical framework. And in terms of the structuralist way, it does look rigid, and the ontologies are talked about. But if you think about the method there, if you think about the structuralist method, post-structuralist method, it is about playing with the categories, which is a recognizably and unabashedly philosophical kind of approach to thinking. So it's not, I don't think we should confuse that with the description of reality in that sense, in which we think the phenomenological one is more like a reality. So I think that could be that's something to think through. And yes, that's all I'm going to say.
That's a good point. Yes, Keisha.
I just want to make one comment. So Ed's thinking about how you were framing it as you don't see yourself as living in these things. And this kind of was the point of my talk, is that I do. Right. So I live in relation to many things, and that in fact, even though like I'm not sort of every moment of my day thinking about that, it is informing all of what I do. Right. So for me, there's a lived element to the approach that I apply to the past that informs my present and my future, and that I live within. And that I actually am, it is not just a concept, it is a practice, it is a law. It requires me to do things in my day-to-day life to leave medicines with this belonging, this relative, right? So for me, it is very much present in my day-to-day life, right? And it informs, it's a framework for which I make sense of everything that I do. So for me, it's not abstract. It is lived in here and present all the time.
And that's why I loved when you said it wasn't a metaphor, and I agree with that completely. And I guess I was just being facetious and saying the meshwork is an idea, right? There becomes perhaps a theory trying to describe a reality, and then, wow, that's representationalism, right?
But the sash is an idea, right? So I use the sash as the weaving, and that is an idea. So don't think of my life as a sash, right. But it is a framework through which I can articulate what my lived experience is and communicate it to other people, right? So for me, there's value in those translations and those ways to make sense of our lived experience and speak to them and represent them in particular ways, because you can't live in my body and in my life, right? So I think I use a sash in a similar way that you might use a meshwork or an assemblage to help make sense of what I live my life,
Agreed. Ollie, did you want to add?
I was saying, I think also the power of encountering difference in that sense is it makes us reflect on our presumptions about our lived experience and actually go, that isn't how it is. So you might not feel that you are an assemblage, for example, but then you start to conceptualize all the territorializing practices that you do every day when you brush your teeth, or you shave, or you get a haircut, and you do all these things that continually territorialize you in a particular kind of way. And we can gloss over those. And I'm not saying that's the only way to think about it, but I think the advantage of encountering a philosophy and Indigenous perspective that causes you to reflect on your own position in the world is precisely that your lived experience, which is apparently given, is revealed as not given, but in fact, a particular form of emergence in the world. And I mean, that, it's the classic thing with Rachel's thing about the patriarchy and her example, right? We live in this patriarchal world, and there are plenty of us men in particular who can wander around and claim, well, that's not my lived experience. I don't I don't see the patriarchy, or I'm colorblind, or whatever other kind of phrase you might want to come up with. And that might accurately describe your experience, not yours, obviously, one's experience of living in the world. But that doesn't accurately describe the political relationships of the world in which we live. And so in that sense, these alternative approaches, and it might be political analysis, it might be ontological analysis, philosophical analysis, Indigenous points of view, whatever one you're picking here, they actually give us a tool to really critically pick apart our assumptions of how the world is and how the world works, and gives us other ways of describing it and communicating it to other people. So I mean, I do kind of see the world in assemblage-y kind of terms now, and in flows and in flux. I mean, it doesn't mean that this computer looks like it's all swimming in front of me. I'm not drunk yet. But there is a kind of there is a form of training and reflection and engagement that for me has genuinely radically transformed how I see the world on a daily basis. And I do think that has also changed my lived experience and my lived experience of the conditions in which I work. And a key, just because it's come to me, I want to add it on. A key part of that is the dialogues that we have, right? So I will reflect on the dialogues that we've had here today, and I continue to reflect on the dialogues we had writing the book. And I continue to reflect on the dialogues. I have like a Zoom with Rachel pretty much every day because we work a lot together. And I'm always reflecting on those dialogues. And they're always changing and altering and becoming something else. And so again, that's the kind of way in which I don't think it's a metaphor either, right? And relationality isn't a metaphor for me either. And it's not a metaphor in the way it isn't a metaphor for Keisha, right? It's not a metaphor for either of us, but it's not a metaphor in the same way, if that makes sense, differently. But I would absolutely agree that it's not a metaphor for me either. And I think that's something that then creates really interesting conversations and productive things like we've been having over the last couple of days. Sorry, that went on longer than I was expecting.
Oh, that's great.